Okay, so my name is Erin Prada. I'm Manager of Digital Learning and Engagement for the Wildlife Conservation Society. If you can, I just want to make sure that my audio is working. So if you, right above the participant room, you should see a square for a series of emoticons. If you could just give me a smiley face. If you hear my audio okay, that would be great. Thank you, Aneen and Jason and Kayla and Peach123, Jessica. All right, great. Okay, let's bear with me for a second. All right, well, welcome to today's webinar. This is our first webinar for the 2015-2016 school year. And we're excited about this school year because the theme will be connected to the topic of tonight's webinar, urban ecology. In addition of having a theme of urban ecology throughout the webinar series, all teachers who participate in the teacher webinars will also have the opportunity to participate the following month with our same expert and have an opportunity to bring our expert into your classroom via a live student webcast to bring the content to your students and potentially connect it with a lesson or a project that you might be doing in between the webinar and that webcast. So I'll mention more information about that later towards the end before we say goodbye. But for tonight, our topic is urban ecology. What is it exactly? Why is it important to teach? And how can you facilitate it in your classroom? Tonight's presentation is going to be facilitated by one of our science experts, Jason. I always mispronounce your name, Jason. Can you, before I butcher it, can you please type in and say it properly for me?
Aloisio.
Thank you. Jason currently works for the Wildlife Conservation Society in zoos and aquarium education. He's a PhD candidate, an urban ecologist, and he currently is our Project True program coordinator. And he'll talk about that a little bit more in his presentation. We're also joined tonight by Paloma Krakower, who is coordinator of professional development for zoos and aquarium education at WCS. And before our experts talk about the science content or lesson ideas to facilitate with your students, I just want to go through some of the interactivity options within the webinar software that we're using here. So everyone, it looks like you already figured out where the emoticon box was when I was testing my audio, so thumbs up. In addition to the smiley face, you have some other options there that you can use throughout the webinar. In the emoticon box, you'll see things like a smiley face, LOL, applause. You're confused about something, thumbs up, thumbs down, move it along, slow down. So those can be pretty helpful. And just in case you logged on after we did that, I just want to make sure you know where the box is. If you follow my pointer here on the screen, you'll see I'm pointing at a toolbox that's above the participant window. For tonight, we're probably going to use the emoticons, and we'll also probably use, if you look over here, I'm going to slide my pointer. Here's that toolbox. On the far end, we might have some polls taken during the presentation. So that box would be where you will participate in the poll. And also if you have a question during any of the presentations, you'll see that there's a hand right here. That would be to raise your hand to ask a question. And feel free to enter your question in the chat box, which is down below. let me think if there's anything else I'm forgetting to cover. So those are some of our interactivity options. The other thing I want to bring your attention to is another interactive space, probably the last interactive space we'll be using tonight, and that is our whiteboard area. So I guess for a little bit of practice to get us started, you should see a map of the United States in that whiteboard area, and to the left of your whiteboard you should see a toolbar that looks similar to this that I'm pointing at here. If you want to just pick a pointer, a laser pointer, I'm currently using a finger, but there's a bunch of other ones you can choose from. There's a sun. Select whichever one is best for you, and if you can, just for the few people who are connected, if you can just click on the map where you're joining us from, that would be great. Okay, so it looks like, oh wow, I think we have somebody from, looks like potentially Tennessee. Everyone looks like they're from New York or the New York metropolitan area, the tri-state area, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. It's kind of hard to tell on the map, but good. You at least can use the laser pointers. You're familiar with the whiteboard now in the event Jason or Paloma decide to use it in their presentation. So let's see, anything else we might be using? Polls, interactivity options, talk tools, I think that's it. So just before we get started, don't forget you can post comments and questions throughout the session in the chat window. I'll be monitoring that. And if for some reason Jason or Paloma don't notice a question that you're asking, I'll direct their attention there. So let's get started. I'm happy to introduce our first presenter, Jason Aloisio. He began working with WCS in 2012 as a PhD student at Fordham University. Jason helped develop urban ecology research and educational programs for people of all ages, primarily with a focus on high school, undergraduate, and graduate students. Jason has since been hired full-time as the program coordinator for Project TRUE. TRUE stands for Teams, Research, Urban Ecology. It's the largest National Science Foundation grant that WCS has been awarded to date. So it's pretty impressive. And I guess while I'm introducing him, I should bring up a picture of him so you know what he looks like. In addition, Jason has extensive experience, his dissertation research focused on plant community dynamics of green roofs in New York City, and he has extensive experience planning and analyzing complex experimental designs using both, oh my goodness, univariate and multivariate statistical approaches in the R environment. Folks, you came to us for science. Jason is going to give you exactly that. I'm going to kind of cut it short because Jason has actually done a lot. He has a really rich background in science and working with teams in urban ecology. So if you could all use your applause button and give him a nice round of applause, I'm going to hand it over to him. Welcome, Jason.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to everybody tonight. Can I just give a little check and make sure that you all can hear me decently right now? Can I get a thumbs up maybe? All right, it's looking good. Okay, so I'm going to just go ahead and dive into this. The talk is titled Discovering Ecology in the Urban Jungle, and I'm going to try to touch on a little bit about our changing planet, what urbanization is, and talk a little bit about the research that I'm doing that will potentially help decrease our environmental impacts on our globe and at the local scale right where we live. And we here are in New York City, but environmental change is happening all over the planet, and a beautiful representation of that was in China over the past couple of years. There's been such a decline in bees and pollinating insects that China's apple farmers have had to climb into their apple trees and pollinate their flowers by hand. And just in case everybody's not familiar with why that's so important, you need to have your flowers be pollinated in order for them to turn into fruits. And so about 75% of all crops in the world require pollination in some way. And globalization and changing environmental conditions as a result of human impacts has seriously put into question whether or not bees and other services provided by the environment will be able to continue to support human life in the way that we currently are aware of it. And so ecosystem services is really a term that's used to describe things like pollination, clean water, and clean air. And it's used to describe things that are provided by the surrounding natural environment. Trees, clean air, produce the oxygen for us, and we're able to go fishing in the oceans when those oceans are clean, and we're able to gather food, and again, that would be considered an ecosystem service. And these types of categories are defined so that we can actually put quantitative values on these things. And we as and these ecosystem services provided by the environment depend on various factors in the environment. And let me see if we can get somebody on the chat. What's anybody have a guess what we're looking at right there? What does that appear to be, or what organism might have caused that feature in the environment? A beaver, absolutely. Beavers. So a beaver is an organism that goes into the environment and changes the environment, right? A beaver makes a beaver dam. A beaver, there he is, makes a beaver dam. And ecologists sometimes describe beavers as ecosystem engineers because they change the environment around them. And as a result, different plants might grow and different food webs might form. Now, when I think about the beaver, I also think that humans are quite a bit like beavers. And here you'll see a picture of Manhattan Island in 2009 on the bottom, and then you'll see a artist's rendering of what Manhattan looked like about 400 years ago, and it's quite different between these two. Humans have paved over the natural surfaces, the vegetation, and the soil, and removed much of the vegetation that was there. So this process of urbanization is dependent on people. And people also continue to change the environment by introducing different plant species, different pollutants, and those introductions create new types of habitats that organisms can take advantage of. So in the current age, the Anthropocene, this current age of man, more than 75% of the ice-free landmass has been altered by humans in some capacity. Species distributions are going across the globe, and we have roads that slice up our pristine forests and fragment our global habitat. And nowhere is this more apparent than in areas like the northeastern corridor of the United States. And let me see if I can get a pointer here. I'm not sure if you guys, can you guys see my pointer right now? Let's see here. There we go. I think that's it. Yeah. And so here there's lots of light pollution and the eastern seaboard, and there's lots of communication. Now, this globalization, in some cases, is quite good, right? We have cured many diseases. We are able to communicate via webinar right now, and you're able to learn a little bit about some of the research that I'm doing. And these sorts of things wouldn't be possible without globalization. But it also can cause some negative impacts. In that upper left-hand corner, a lot of you are from the New York City area, and you might be familiar with this. This is a subway station. Is there supposed to be water in that subway station? No, there is not supposed to be water in that subway station. That occurred as a result of Storm Sandy that came through a few years ago. And here's another image showing some of the devastation that occurred to the human infrastructure that we created as a result of natural disasters. And this is quite apparent in urban areas where we have changed the natural landscape so drastically. Let's see here. So urbanization, or creating a city, is really defined by a population-dense area where there's lots of paved surfaces. You have roads, buildings, parking lots, etc. And that obviously has negative environmental impacts as well as negative impacts on human health. Higher rates of obesity in many cases, higher rates of asthma, and urbanization is expected to increase. In the next 15 years, urban areas are expected to increase by about 60%. So there's an absolute explosion of urban development going on right now. In the United States, about 80% of people already live in urban areas, but much of that urban growth is actually going to occur in Asia and Africa. So before we have urbanization occurring, we have a natural ecosystem that has a high degree of ecosystem services. There's really oxygen-rich air. Water is being absorbed by the soil and going down into our aquifers, and we're having rich biodiversity. Lots of different species are present. But when we urbanize, we create a city, and we lose those ecosystem services because we no longer have natural members of our community, and we are putting smog into the air and changing the dynamic very much. However, we can mitigate the negative effects of our city by introducing green infrastructure. Can I get a little show of yeses or nos from everybody? Are you familiar with green infrastructure? Yes, yes. Yes. Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about some specific green infrastructure. I'm going to talk about green roofs more specifically. But I want to show you this neat little image and bring us back to this idea that humans, yes, us, we are the ecosystem engineers. We not only build these buildings, but we can also design them in such a way that we can increase the degree of ecosystem services within our urban environment. And so one type of green infrastructure is a bioswale. And I'm going to try to bring in, let's see if I can do this. I'm going to try to bring in an image from somewhere else real quick here. That doesn't seem to be, let's see if I can do this. Cancel. I'm trying to bring in an image, and 1 second here. Okay, I got it. Okay. There it is right there. So before before urbanization occurred, water would come down from the sky in precipitation, and it would be absorbed into the ground. It would infiltrate into the ground. Whereas when, let me see if this image comes up again. Oops. Here. Whereas when we pave over, this ratio flip-flops, and instead of 80% of the water going down into the ground, 80% of the water flows off of our paved surfaces, collecting pollutants and going into our surrounding waterways and causing polluted waterways. So one of the ways that we can stop that is by introducing these bioswales, and it's basically cutting the side of a roadway off and putting in a little patch of green space that can capture water. Now, this has been going on all around the city, thanks to Mayor Bloomberg's Plan NYC. They've done some preliminary studies to develop ways of mitigating the amount of water that runs off of our roadways into our surrounding waterways. And they've been using these bioswales to create mini urban watersheds. I think Paloma is going to touch a little bit more on watersheds later. But basically what's happening, if you look at this image here, water flows down each one of these corridors in the direction of the arrow when precipitation events occur. And it goes down into a sewer, down here, and into our surrounding waterway, okay? And we can reduce the amount of water that's going down into this sewer and into our waterway by inserting these bioswales at each one of these locations. And as water runs down the street, it will now go inside of one of these bioswales and be absorbed there. Okay, and here is a figure showing that there is in fact a 10, 15, 20% decreases in the amount of stormwater that's running off of our streets when we introduce these bioswales. So it's a really powerful demonstration of how we can introduce a little bit of beautiful green parks on our streets and improve our water, as well as improve how pretty our streets are, really. So that's an example of a bioswale, but I want to more specifically talk about green roofs. This is a sort of a typical image of a green roof, where it's called an extensive green roof, and these plants that are growing on here, these plants that are growing on here are called sedum, and it doesn't look amazing, but it looks prettier than a black roof, I think, and it provides a bunch of different ecosystem services that are really highly valuable in urban environments. If you look up here, it cleans air by getting particulate matter out of the air, producing oxygen. It absorbs water, so it reduces the amount of water going into our storm systems. It actually cools the building down, so you use less air conditioning and less air conditioning, and therefore less CO2 emissions from the electricity. And it also creates habitat and increases the biodiversity in the city. And these various benefits of a green roof have been extensively studied in the literature for a number of years. And in Germany, these green roofs have been installed for upwards of 100 years. So there's a rich history of installing green roofs. These plants are sedum and succulent plant species. They're kind of like little cactuses, if you will. And they're the most common kind of plant species that's used on a green roof. And they're the one that you saw a little bit earlier. Now, a sedum grows really well on a green roof because it's well adapted to the harsh environmental conditions that you find on a roof. The roof is sunny, it's full of, it's gravelly soil, and it's very thin soil. So it's a tough environment to live in, and these sedum are very hardy plants. However, the data suggests that the benefit, the hydrological, the biological, and the educational benefits, the ecosystem services that we get from installing a green roof kind of flatline when we use sedums or we use succulent plant species. No matter how much we spend on a green roof, no matter how many different species of these succulents we plant, there's still going to be low-growing species that are not able to absorb tons of water and will not be highly biologically diverse. Okay? And if we were informed, if we were better informed about the parameters that we use to design a green roof, then we might be able to actually improve the ecosystem services that are provided by that green roof. And so this really is the main question that I've focused on for my dissertation research. How can we increase the ecosystem services in cities to improve human health and to improve the environment? And so these plant species right here are two different kinds of plant species, or two different groups of plants. The one on the left are grasses or graminoids. I wonder if I can write that. Let's see. Graminoid. There it is. So this is a graminoid. Oops. Right here, a graminoid. They're grasses and sedges and rushes. And this other one over here, we would classify as a forb. Let's see if I can make that a little bigger. Having a little bit of trouble. I don't know if you guys can see that. But the one on the right is a forb. And they're characterized by herbaceous vegetation that is generally upright and not a grass. Okay, so these are two different kinds, groups of plants that are not sedums and might grow well on green roofs. And so we think if you add different groups of plant species to a rooftop, excuse me, it's sort of a mixed vegetation palette. And we think that as you install greater diversity, you're going to get more benefits, more ecosystem services. And sure enough, some data currently supports that hypothesis. Greater plant diversity on green roofs increases the ecosystem services of that green roof. And so here is what a biodiverse green roof might look like with some of those grasses and forbs, as well as some sedum down here, mixed vegetation. Now it turns out though that mixed vegetation with graminoids and grasses, graminoids and forbs, the survivorship, or the percent of plants that survive, the percent of individuals that survive once you plant them on a green roof, is quite low. In only 2 different studies that were published in the last few years was there 100% survivorship, meaning all of the plants that were planted survived. Whereas we see quite a few different studies being completed where survivorship is 0, 20, and 30%. So even though data suggests that the ecosystem services increased with mixed vegetation, we have really poor survivorship. And if we can't have plants surviving and they're dying, then we're never going to be able to have biodiverse green roofs and improve the ecosystem services. So this is where I have been focusing my research on figuring out what affects plant survivorship. And there's sort of two main groups of things that can affect plant survivorship. There's biotic factors, and these include things like species traits, the growth forms, whether it's a graminoid or a forb or a succulent, interactions with other plants, whether it be competition or facilitation, and interaction with other trophic groups. So that's involving things like herbivory occurring as a result of insects or pollination services, causing changes in plant reproductive fitness. Also, abiotic factors like temperature and the growing media are going to play an important role in what affects plant survivorship. So the objective of this study was to evaluate the effects of abiotic and biotic factors on survivorship of plant species assemblages. So let's break that up a little bit. A species assemblage is just a group of species. And in this case, we used an approach, an adaptive matching approach, where we selected two environments, the Hempstead Plains and the Rocky Summit Grasslands. And these two plant communities are similar, have similar conditions to green roofs. They're hot areas that don't have any trees present for the most part. They're kind of like grasslands or meadows, and there's very low nutrient availability in these soils. So they are sort of like what the conditions would be like on a green roof. So we went to these two areas and we selected plant species. So where are these two areas? Well, they're quite close to where you guys are. Fordham campus is here, Rose Hill. Right now I'm talking to you guys from the Calder Center, as a matter of fact. This is the Lewis Calder Biological Field Station that Fordham owns and operates in Westchester. And the Rocky Summit Grasslands are over there in Harriman State Park, just on the other side of the Hudson River. And the Hempstead Plains are the only historical prairie that exists east of the Mississippi. And it was once widespread on Long Island, but now it's relegated to just a very small patch, about 40 acres in size. So it's a globally rare type of ecosystem. So we went to these sites and we found 8 different plant species in each one of them. Now, obviously, in each one of those ecosystems, there's lots and lots and lots of different plants. Probably at least 100, but several hundred probably more likely. We obviously couldn't select all of those, so what we did was we selected some of the most common characteristic species from each one of those systems. And we made it so there would be an equal number of different growth forms in each one of our species assemblage treatments. So our growth forms, as a reminder, is listed down on the bottom of the screen. And you see graminoid, remember those are grasses, nitrogen fixer, that takes nitrogen out of the air and turns it into plant available nitrogen, so it increases the nutrient availability in the soil. And then we have various kinds of forbs, and then different kinds of photosynthesis, but don't worry about that for right now. So you'll notice in each one of these species assemblages, we have 3 grasses or graminoids, and then we have 5 different types of forbs. Okay, so that's important to remember. So we took these 2 different species assemblages and we planted them on roofs. And so we built a series of plots here, 12 of these 12 plots, and each one of them was split into half to create 24 split plots. And in each one of these split plots, we put in blue either the Rocky Summit Grasslands or in red the Hempstead Plains. See how it's on either side? And each one of those squares, we used one of these planting maps, which you'll see right here, one of these sort of quilt-looking things. And so what this meant is that we were able to track the locations of each and every plant species that we planted and figure out whether it survived or not. And we also established these plots at different depths of growing media to figure out if the depth of growing media had an effect on the species survivorship. Now, this roof that you see right here was actually replicated at 10 different locations all across the city. And so with 10 roofs and 2,400 plants on each roof, we actually tracked 24,000 plants since October of 2010. All right, so that's the experimental design. And here is what one of those beautiful roofs look like. This is in Staten Island. And you can see on one side it's Hempstead Plains, and on the other side it's Rocky Summit Grasslands. And again here, you can see the difference very apparent in these two sides. The left side here where I'm standing, it was a wet day in Chelsea, is the Hempstead Plains, and it's dominated by a lot of graminoids and grasses. Whereas on the right side, you'll see this is a Rocky Summit Grassland plot, and it's actually a little bit shorter in height, and it's dominated by forbs instead of those graminoids and grasses. So immediately we can see that there are some differences between these species assemblages despite having the same growth form combinations. Here it is again. Here's our planting map, and let me just go back here. And after 2 years, I went to each one of these squares and determined if the plant had survived or not. Okay? And so I'm going to be showing you some survivorship data. We found out using VCA, which is variance component analysis. It's a statistical analysis that determines the amount of variation that's associated with different parameters of your experimental design. And what we determined was that species identity explains the most amount of variation in our data. Well, what does that really mean? It means that some plants had above 50% survivorship, many of them survived, while other plants had below 10% survivorship. So there was quite a bit of variation in the amount of survivorship for each individual species. The ones that you see here, the 6 that you see here, were the 6 that had the highest amount of survivorship. So in the Hempstead Plains, you can see it was little blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. So it was all these grasses. Whereas in the Rocky Summit Grasslands, we had 2 different forbs having high survivorship and this tiny little clump growing grass, which only grows a couple inches. So we can see that these plants, species assemblages that we planted, look very different after a couple years of being planted. And here is a figure that describes that a little bit more closely. If you look at the 2010 bar, you'll see that the forb, the N forb, the nitrogen-fixing forb, and the graminoid are equal between the 2010 Hempstead Plains and the 2010 Rocky Summit Grasslands. After 2 years, graminoids become the dominant proportion of the dominant growth form, whereas in the Rocky Summit Grasslands, forbs, nitrogen-fixing and non-nitrogen-fixing forbs, actually become the dominant and go a little bit over 50%. So we're seeing a different in the way that these 2 species assemblages look. All right, so this is a busy page, but bear with me. All right, and there's some stats on here, but bear with me. This image on the top left simply shows that we had different sets of species assemblages, and then we had different individual species surviving in each community type, in each species assemblage. And then what we actually did was we took each and every one of those plots, and each and every one of those plots is represented by one of these little points, and we put on the x-axis plant survivorship. So that's the percent of plants that survive in a given plot, right? So if you're up here anywhere, 100%, all 100 plant individuals that were planted in the plot survived, and here 0, none of the individuals that were planted in the plot survived. Now we measured 2 different things that were associated with describing the physical characteristics of the species assemblages, the plant communities. Sward height, which is simply the height that the plants grew, measured with a meter stick, and the percent cover, which is measured just the percentage cover of vegetation, and that's measured through a visual estimation. And what we found, unsurprisingly, was that as the amount of survivorship increases, you also see an increase in plant cover and in sward height. Now, what was particularly interesting is that, or two relevant points here I want to point out, is that the Hempstead Plains, the one that had lots of grasses, had generally a much higher sward height. So it grew taller. And typically when plants grow taller, it means there's more biomass there, and that ultimately may mean more ecosystem services because it may be able to capture more carbon from the air, and the leaf area may be greater, and that may allow for greater gas exchange and actually may cool the air more compared to the Rocky Summit grasslands, which generally has less leaf surface area, according to this figure. Now, we did see, now if you look at the bottom graph, what we actually see is a significant interaction effect, and that's the S by C, P is less than 0.001. So what happens here actually is that these two regression lines actually cross over one another. So in the top image, they're parallel with one another, whereas in the bottom image, they cross one another. This indicates that planting density, or the number of plant species that survive in a given plot, is affecting the amount of plant cover differently depending on the species assemblage that you plant. And so what we can tell from here is that as you get a higher survivorship in the Rocky Summit grasslands, you actually have a steeper curve, and so you kind of get more bang for your buck. Whereas in the Hempstead Plains, you get a less gradual increase in sort of your investment. So the more plant species you plant and the more that survive, you're not necessarily getting as much cover as you would when you're using the Rocky Summit grasslands. All right? And so what we also found was that the amount of biomass that grew in these plots, on average for the Hempstead Plains, 260 grams per meter squared, and on average 180 grams per meter squared of above ground plant biomass, actually is similar to the alpine tundra or the grasslands. It kind of falls in between those kinds of ecosystems, and that sort of makes sense because these green roofs are being, or these plant species are being planted on green roofs that are sort of like grasslands, but they're on the tops of these buildings. So it's sort of like a mountaintop. Okay, let's see. I'm going to try to, I think I'm getting, that's a lot of plants. It is indeed. I think I'm getting near to the end. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions at this point? I'll pause here because that's sort of the end of that piece before I move on to the next piece, which I'll cover pretty kind of briefly because I think we're running out of time. Any questions?
Jason, this is Erin. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I'm just actually curious. I know you mentioned earlier in the presentation that Paloma is probably going to touch on watersheds a bit, and you were trying to make that connection with bioswales. With a lot of the research that you just laid out, it's really interesting, all this research about these different plants and what you are learning. For some of the teachers that are connected in the webinar right now, Do you have any like quick ideas for how they might take something that you've done and do, I mean, especially for elementary teachers, K through 5, how they might take a miniature version of what you've done to maybe even like kind of replicate an experiment at a very elementary level? I'm putting you on the spot, sorry about that.
Well, you could, so I think Paloma's, well, if you want to test plant species and whether or not they will survive in harsh conditions, that's something pretty easy to do. As a matter of fact, on a roof, it's going to be a water limiting environment, which means you're not going to have a lot of water availability, and soils are generally these really sandy, nutrient poor, gravelly soils. And the reason we use those sandy, nutrient poor, gravelly soils is because if they dry out on the roof, which they will, gravel is heavy and it stays weighed down. And so if you were to use a potting soil or something like a dirt, black dirt on a roof, and it was to dry out, wind would come and erode that soil away, and you would lose your soil, and it would make a mess all over the street, and your plants would die because they would have nothing else to root in, and it would be a big mess. So the soil and the plants are two of the most important, arguably the most important parts of a green roof. And so you can do a bajillion simple experiments where you take different kinds of growing substrate, growing media, crushed up bricks, gravel, different proportions of soil and gravel and organic material, wood chips, different proportions of any of these different kinds of material. And then you can grow a plant in those different kinds of soil, and you can give them different water treatments. So you could give them one watering per week, or you could stretch it out longer and imagine what it would be like under super drought conditions and wait several weeks before watering and see how long the plants are able to survive between watering events in different kinds of growing media. So you could, and those are sort of the three things that I would recommend sort of adjusting: the type of growing substrate that you're growing in, the amount of water that you're putting in, or maybe the plant species. So that's some really easy and neat and fun and measurable things that you could do immediately over time as far as an experiment is concerned. And I see that Mary has asked, were you able to measure air quality surrounding the experimental planting? So that's a great question, Mary. And instead of being, well, maybe some of you are familiar that WNYC is doing a bunch of studies right now with Columbia University measuring air quality all around the city. And so instead, right now, what we have available is stationary air quality monitoring stations all around New York City. And they're on, and I took the data from those air quality monitoring stations that were at each one of our given roofs, and then I'm relating the soil conditions at the different locations surrounding the city to the environment, to the air quality data that we collected at nearby stations. Now, my research question was not specifically on, does this green roof improve the air quality right there? Because that would require sort of different experimental procedures. But instead I went the other way and looked to say, does the air quality in a given area affect the plants that are on those roofs and how many are surviving or not? And so, for example, in Manhattan and in the Bronx, there's higher particulate matter in the air than there is out in Queens. And we had roofs in each of those locations, so we can begin to evaluate whether or not the microclimate conditions that occur in an urban area already are affecting the plants that we plant on a given roof across the city. So we're kind of looking at it through the opposite direction. But again, Mary, we know already that plants on green roofs do take particulate matter out from the air from studies that other people have done. So we know that it is improving and reducing the temperature already, but the degree to which mixed vegetation is doing that compared to sedum vegetation, those sort of simple mixes, that's not fully understood yet, and further research will need to be done to get at that. Okay, so you're welcome. And so I think that's probably about it for me as far as my time is concerned. Is that right?
Yeah.
Should that be it right there?
Yes. Thank you.
Let me finish with one final point, if you wouldn't mind.
No, go ahead.
I'm just going to show you guys. Let me just see if I can. So here, here again is some of these beautiful pictures. Up on these roofs, when you're on a roof and it's covered with plants, I'm sure many of you have been on a roof, and it's in New York City or in any city, and it's pretty amazing. It's always just a fantastic, beautiful view. You feel like a bird, and you're looking over the entire city, and it's often a very beautiful view. But when you're standing on a roof and there's plants there along with you, you feel like you're in a meadow in the canopy of the jungle, sort of looking out over this busy urban oasis. And so putting plants up on the roof can really have a significant impact. And there's data that shows that not only does it improve these environmental factors, but actually people are happier and calmer and more relaxed when they work in buildings that have views of green roofs. So there's psychological benefits there as well. And then I just wanted to show one other figure right here. I want to go back to my thesis point here, which is that humans are ecosystem engineers, and we have chosen to construct our cities in certain ways, and we can now use the research that I'm doing and other researchers are doing to make informed decisions about the way that we construct our cities when we move forward from here. So I encourage you as teachers to have your kids think a little bit about urban ecology and how we are designing our cities now and forever. And with that, I have lots of people to thank, and I'm happy to take questions. That's my email address. I'm sure you guys have seen that. And I will turn it over to Erin, I think, at this point, to introduce Paloma. Thanks so much. It was great talking with you guys.
Thanks, Jason. That was great. So if you haven't participated in our webinars before, the second half of the session will be brought to you by Paloma Krakower, who is a coordinator of professional development within the Wildlife Conservation Society in our Zoos and Aquarium Education Division. And she's going to really kind of try to take some of the content or the science that Jason's been talking about and basically give you an idea for how you could potentially bring urban ecology into your classroom with some of those science concepts. So Paloma, just want to make sure your audio is working. Are you there?
Hello. Can everyone hear
Hi.
me? All right. Well, can you guys give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? All right. Great. Pleasure being here with you this evening. So first of all, I just want to give a round of applause to Jason and thank you for sharing your work with us this evening. Okay, so we are going to take...
Actually, Paloma, can I interrupt just for a second?
Certainly.
I just want to give you a proper introduction because I just realized I didn't really do that. Paloma, just so you know, in addition to being a coordinator of professional development for WCS, she also is an expert in terms of coming up with ideas for teachers to utilize in the classroom. She has her master's in environmental conservation education from New York University, and she's been working at WCS combining both her interest in wildlife and education. She's come to us after completing joint animal care and education internships with both the Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation Inc. and the Cheetah Conservation Fund in Namibia. So I'm excited that Paloma is able to join us tonight. So now, Paloma, you may officially. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Erin. All right, guys. So basically, we are going to focus on one aspect of what Jason was talking about this evening, and that is urban watersheds. So for you guys as elementary teachers, this is a topic that you guys can really utilize and still be very relevant in your classrooms with your students. But before we get too far, I want to first try out some of our interactivities. So in your toolbar, you should have a text box. So it is that little box with an A and some lines in it. And I want you guys to use this feature to come up with some words that make you think of New York. So for instance, I'm going to put in a text box, and feel free to put your words right up in this space. So we're going to take a few minutes to do this now. What do you associate when you see New York? Pavements. That's it? You only think of pavement? Come on, you can do it. Apples. Skyscrapers. Okay. All right. So we have quite a mix of words here. So some of them have to do with our urban setting, right? With pavement, with skyscrapers, with it being crowded. So all those things that we live in our day-to-day lives, right? Here as New Yorkers. But then we also have some natural elements here as well. So I see the Adirondacks, the Long Island Sound. We also have some apples, good old Big Apple here. So I'm happy to see that not all of our words that we used were basically had to do with the urban setting, right? So much of New York is actually such a beautiful landscape that many people outside of New York do not realize that we have at our disposal here. So I also heart New York. Thank you very much, whoever wrote that. So quickly, I also want to do a poll feature. So like Erin said, you guys have that poll feature right next to the hand raising. I quickly want to see what you guys think a watershed is. And please select the answer that you think is the most accurate. So go ahead and do that right now for me. Okay, so it looks like everyone has put in their results, and we have that here. So we have a few people who selected A. Let's see. A place where you store water. And the majority of you, however, selected C. And that is the correct answer. So an area of land that drains into a body of water is what a watershed is. It's also known as a drainage basin as well. So what you might not know is that watersheds come in all sizes. For instance, a footprint in the ground that collects water after rainfall could even be considered a watershed. And there are many watersheds that are made up of smaller bodies of water as well. So a watershed ultimately gets its name, though, from the outflow point. So the outflow point determines the limits of the larger watershed. Okay? So, let's see. Bear with me right now. So here is a picture of a watershed that we were working with before. So essentially, any sort of precipitation, whether it be rain or snow, travels down this land area into a body of water. So like we were saying before, all these little offshoots, they could all be separate watersheds, but they're ultimately coming down into this larger watershed body here. And I will try and use my laser pointer. So here is our greater water body shed, right? And this watershed divide is basically where the limits of one watershed into another. So the things that we often think about is it's easy to imagine water flowing off a mountaintop into a body of water, right? But water can also travel through aquifers or groundwater. So it can seep into the ground and travel continuously until it gets to that larger outflow point. Okay? Does anyone have any questions up to this point? I've just thrown a lot of facts at you. No? Okay. So, what you may not know is that we all live in a watershed. Sorry there, my volume might have gotten... Can everyone give me a thumbs up again? I think I messed up with my volume here, if you can hear me. Okay, great. So, we all live in a watershed. Every single person on Earth lives in a watershed. So we are all connected in that regards, which is pretty cool when you think about it. And I want to take one more second now for you guys to type in the chat box how you think watersheds are connected to urban ecology. And Jason gave you some ideas a little bit before, but how else are watersheds connected? So take a few moments to type in the chat box what you think. So Anine says the permeability or impermeability of urban surfaces. And that is definitely true. I see Mary's working on a response as well. So I'm going to hold off for one more second. Okay. So Anine is definitely correct. So watersheds, right, as Jason was talking about, have a lot to do with our urban environment when we think about stormwater runoff. So stormwater, basically anything from precipitation, including pollutants, it can be natural particles, that can all get into our natural water systems, right? Because of the impermeability of the urban surfaces. So essentially that there's no soil through which this water can be absorbed, and all of that with great speed often brings all these pollutants or extra particles into our water sources. So thank you, Anine, for that. Okay. So Jason already mentioned to you guys ecosystem services before in his presentation, and if you remember, they are the benefits that people get from nature. So watersheds provide us with our drinking water, whether it comes from a reservoir network or from ground wells. So we all get our drinking water from watersheds. And for example, in New York City, our drinking water supply provides approximately about 1.2 billion gallons of high-quality water to about 8 million New Yorkers every day. And that is a pretty impressive statistic there. And a little biased, I grew up personally next to a reservoir that supplies New York City some of its water. So I am a big fanatic about how great New York City water systems are. So you're going to hear me talk about that a little bit and brag about how great upstate New York is. So watersheds are also really dynamic ecosystems that support a great deal of biodiversity, both plant and animal species. But most importantly, in the context of urban ecology, there, like I was just talking about, is the issue of stormwater runoff. So we, in New York here, we are part of the greater Hudson River watershed. So a lot of the times when we think of New York City, right, we think of the urban jungle, and it's really easy to forget the greater seascapes that surround us, being an island. So the Hudson River has such a large presence here in our urban landscape, both in terms of the biological features, but also the commercial and the aesthetic features that it provides us as well. So, not surprisingly, the Hudson River is our largest watershed. So, the river itself is about 315 miles, ranging from the Adirondack Mountains to the very bottom of Manhattan. So on the slide here it says the Hudson River watershed is home to about 5 million people and encompasses 5 states: New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey. So it is quite an impressive feature. So when we were talking about ecosystem services before, right, the Hudson River watershed, as with any watershed, it provides us with improved water quality. So it also helps filter out natural pollutants. So natural landscapes are like sponges. They help us wipe out all of the bad stuff before it hits our drinking water supply. And they also help with carbon storage opportunities. So intact watersheds, for instance, with natural land cover and soil resources are capable of sequestering carbon and therefore offsetting greenhouse gases, like Jason was talking about with his green roof examples and his research as well. It also gives us increased resilience in the face of climate change threats. Intact floodplains in areas with healthy watersheds are able to withstand greater weather extremes as well. And last but not least, in terms of a biological sense, they also help the risk of invasive species colonization. So essentially, naturally functioning ecosystems are more resilient to favor indigenous species. So it helps keep ecosystems intact. Okay. So one great activity that you guys can do with your students is to build your own watershed model. This is by no means a new activity, and some of you may already have seen this or already done it in your own classrooms. Can I see a thumbs up if you have already, or once upon a time, built a watershed model in your classroom? Okay, so see a thumbs down. So at least Jessica, and Anine, I'm very excited to be showing you something new here. Ah, great. So none of you have done this. So this is going to be great then. So essentially you can all really easily build your own watershed models. You just need any sort of tray that can retain your water, and whatever sort of resources you want to create natural landscapes. So for instance, our coffee mate here is my highest peak in my mountain range, and these cups as well. You don't even need actual materials. You can just use crumpled up pieces of paper that you can put at various heights. You just need to create a landscape that has different slope points. So after you create whatever landscape you think is appropriate, you just put a plastic bag or saran wrap over these objects, and you tuck it in to create natural folds. So for instance, you want to try and make sure that the plastic is molded as well as possible to these landforms to mimic the actual shape of a mountainous range. So from there, you can actually take any sort of spray bottle and just spray water, and you will have the effects of precipitation. And as you can see in my very poor diorama over here, sorry about that, that you will start to see water collecting in natural given spots. So it has a tendency to trickle down gradually into various different ravines, or as we will see, watershed bases here. So this is great because it's not material heavy, and it's something that you can do with students of any age. The tools are very basic, and it also allows you to engage students in authentic inquiry. A great way for you guys to do this is to really let the kids go free. I know as teachers that can be a little scary from time to time, but you would be amazed to see what sort of observations the kids are able to come up with on their own. So other materials that you can include sponges. You can do food coloring. You can actually throw in real soil in there, glitter, oil, really anything that will further the inquiry process for your students. So I want to talk about briefly what these different materials could mimic. So for instance, they could represent fertilizers or pesticides. They can represent car oil, trash, whatever really that has the potential to enter our local watersheds due to human activity. So once you add these items, you can spray the water on the model again and see what happens. Through Jason's representation, we know that plants in urban ecosystems play a very vital role in mitigating some of the effects of stormwater runoff. Well, plants in more natural settings play the same role. So as we talked about, soil and vegetation help slow down the speed in which water travels through the watershed because it is being absorbed through the ground and it's taken in by the plants. So essentially they help to regulate the flow of water and to prevent or lessen the effects of flooding or erosion in a given area. And the sponge could serve as a representation of the soil and plants that would be found within the natural landscape. So I briefly want to read this quote from you by Douglas Llewellyn. It's from his book, Inquire Within. So he says, "We have seen that learning science is an ongoing process of conceptual change in modifying our understanding. Similar to the way scientists continue to modify their models and theories, learning is a continuous active process. For many of us, inquiry is the perfect vehicle for facilitating a cognitive-based constructivist approach to learning. In an inquiry constructivist approach, the learner is engaged in a hands-on science-related question, problem, or investigation. During an investigation, the child observes questions and gathers evidence to test his or her present understanding, forming an explanation that constructs meaning for new scientific knowledge." So, through this model, students of all ages are able to engage in science learning the potential to make it all the way through the inquiry cycle is there. So they have the engagement points. They're able to explore and see what happens both with and without these added elements of like the sponges or the oil. And they're really going to be able to explain the phenomenons that they're seeing. So for instance, with the food coloring, if you were to add the food coloring and spray the water, you should see all of the colors blending into that one main watershed area. So once they're able to explain and they're able to explore this model, they should be able to elaborate on some of the concepts that they're saying. So, for instance, this would be a great segue to be talking about the effects of pollution in your local habitat. And that might even allow students to reevaluate some of their prior knowledge and think about the greater consequences of actions and how we can protect our own environment. So that being said, the completion of the entire inquiry cycle may not be appropriate for all grade levels within elementary school. So I want to put this back on you guys, and once again I'm going to ask you to fill out in the chat box how you would differentiate this activity for really earlier elementary students. So take a few moments and type in the chat box how you would differentiate this activity. See some furious typing, so I'm going to give you another minute or so. So Anine says perhaps engaging the kids in building the actual model with clay and have them make guesses about where the water will go. Excuse me, as I'm losing my voice. And Kayla, we have for really early elementary, I think it would be appropriate to simply use this activity to represent the flow of water and be able to follow the water and watch it pool and form ponds and such. So exactly, it is as simple as that, guys. So thank you so much for providing those examples. So like in my mind, for really early elementary, for kindergarten or first grade, some probing questions that you as a teacher could ask if you find that your students are struggling with their own observations is really just simply asking them, what do they notice? What happened to the water? What direction did the water flow? Where did the water go, etc. So both Anine and Kayla were insinuating that as well. You could also consider making a larger scale model that might make the visualization process easier for younger students. For instance, you could make a much larger scale model with backpacks or furniture to also mimic the slope of a watershed, and then use something like a tarp to take the place of the plastic wrap or the plastic bag. And instead of water, you could pour like beads or marbles, anything that will roll nicely off the top of the surface to generate the same effect as the smaller marble. And Anine gave us that, thanks. Anine gave us the impervious versus the pervious surfaces example earlier. And you could also do something as simple as going outside with your students, and this could still work for teachers in urban environments. You could try pouring water on different surface types. So for instance, on grass beds or on tree plots versus on concrete, to have students visualize the difference between the two surface types. And then I know here in New York City, in second grade, students are already starting to investigate soil and plant diversity. So you could even consider putting different soil types in your model to mimic the effects of like sandy versus clay soil, and which has greater permeability. And by third grade, students are going into plant and animal adaptations. That could be an extension that you throw into this activity. Fourth grade, they're looking at interactions between air, water, and land, which is a very nice tie-in in terms of the erosion processes or how you could tie in pollution. And by fifth grade, they are really starting to focus on exploring specific ecosystems. So that is a great segue into opportunities for how you guys can make local connections. So for our purposes right now, I'm going to focus on the Hudson River estuary. So you can see a picture of the lovely New York here. Part of the Hudson River is 153 miles to be exact of the 315 miles of the Hudson River is actually a tidal estuary where salt water from the sea and fresh water from the watershed meet. So if you guys didn't know, estuaries are one of the Earth's most productive ecosystems, and we actually have one right here in our urban backyard, which is pretty cool. So the ocean's tidal pulse can be felt all the way up to Troy, New York. So I'm going to briefly go back to this slide. So Troy, as you can see, is all the way up here. So from here all the way to the tip of Manhattan is the Hudson River estuary. And let's see. So estuaries provide habitat to thousands of different species and are often called nurseries of the sea. So they are influenced by ocean tides but are protected from the full force of ocean waves, winds, and storms, and are therefore safe nesting or spawning areas for many marine species. And like we talked about before, estuaries are also natural filtration and buffer systems that help make our waters both cleaner and safer. And yes, the Hudson River estuary is quite an impressive beast. It is more than half of all of the Hudson River, so I appreciate the enthusiasm for our natural water system here. So there are so many different ways to explore an ecosystem. You can have your students, for instance, go out and actually get dirty, right? That might not be an option for all of you guys, depending on where you're located. Most of us this evening are from the New York City area, but depending on whatever local ecosystem you have, you can have your students explore the different plant and animal species that exist. For instance, we have bog bluegrass, which is one native plant species that we can find in the Hudson River estuary. Once again, you can talk about the different soil types. And as Jason mentioned before, you can actually do investigations within your classroom about different plant species that can grow with these different soil types that you find out and about in your ecosystems. So you could do things like scavenger hunts of different plant and animal species. You can talk about different plant and animal adaptations. So for instance, here, these are 4 different species that we could potentially find if we were to go out in the Hudson River estuary. So we have the marsh wren, the different types of catfish, oysters, and the northern diamondback terrapin. These are all species that you can do basically more in-depth research projects for some of your older elementary students. So you can have them essentially become animal experts on one given species, whether it be plant or animal. And basically, they get to talk about the different interactions that happen within this ecosystem. So for instance, that could be the starting point of an activity that has to do with food webs or food chains and connections that you can do with predator-prey type activities. And you can also make local social studies connections. So for instance, with the oysters, right? Not only are they a biological feature that we have, but they also serve a very commercial purpose for a lot of New Yorkers who consume oysters. So it has a connection to the fishing industry as well. So making those local connections in that sort of regard is just the starting point. And there are also many other organizations that you can use as resources as well. For instance, if we go back to the slide right here, this is Pier 40 on Lower Manhattan. Organizations such as the River Project offer school programs for classes right off of Pier 40 where you can explore organisms of the estuary, and you can learn about the importance of conservation in urban settings. Local park rangers are also great resources. Your local zoos and aquariums might also have activities through which you can get some inspiration for as well. So, that being said, I think I am coming to a close on what I wanted to deliver to you guys. Here are some standard connections that we have made in all of these activities that I was talking with you about now. But does anyone have any questions before I do any final wrap-up here? All right, no questions? Okay, so essentially I just wanted to end before I head back to Erin, saying that the urban ecosystem is so complex and dynamic and really deserves our attention. And as Jason pointed out before, as humans we are ecosystem engineers, and our actions greatly impact our environment. So there is so much natural life that surrounds us that we rely so heavily in our day-to-day lives here in this urban ecosystem. So it's really quite vital that we let our students know and teach them how to become familiar with their native habitat and also to better take care of it. And briefly talking about watersheds and making that connection that we all use water from our watersheds on a daily basis, not only for health but also for recreation and survival needs. That's a great starting point to talk about different ecosystems and also the other organisms that exist here as well. So I just want to say thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back to Erin.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I just want to kind of walk through some resources that will be available to you. But first, let me just thank all of you mostly for joining us today. I know it's tough after a full day of teaching, so thank you so much for listening to the content and the ideas for incorporating into your classroom. A big thank you to our presenters, Jason, Aloisio, and Paloma Krakower, for excellent and informative information. I want to remind everyone that this webinar course the webinar course site, which you all have access to in the Online Teacher Academy through our Moodle platform, that site's going to be available for up to a year. So I actually were a little bit behind in updating that page for you. Tonight and tomorrow morning, a whole bunch of resources are going to be added to that page. Some of the resources that Paloma mentioned, some additional resources that haven't been mentioned tonight, and links to contact information if you'd like to reach out with further questions. If you could do us a great favor, I'm going to actually put right now a link to a very short survey in the chat window. If you could just give us some feedback on tonight's webinar, we'd really appreciate that because we do have several more coming up over the next couple of months. Here is the link right now. You don't have to do that this minute, but if you can at least go to the survey and bookmark it. It is really quick, so if you have 5 minutes, do it now. If not, feel free to do it in the morning. I'd also like to direct you to our next slide here before you leave. Give me a second. Oh, that's just a quick shot of the Moodle course site just to remind you about that site. There is one specific to this very webinar. In addition, for those of you that are interested, for those of you participating tonight, we are able to provide you with a certificate for PD credit hours. So please feel free to email me directly and I can provide that for you. My email is at the bottom of that slide. It is cprada@wcs.org. And I'll be sending out a thank you email with my contact information if you didn't get that. Last but not least, if you just visit the Teacher Professional Development webpage that we have, that's probably where you went to register for the webinar initially. We will be updating the calendar shortly, and there will be another teacher webinar in November, in January, and in March. Jason and Paloma have done a great job of setting the tone, the theme of this year's series of urban ecology. What you could look for in November, January, and March is urban ecology as it applies to a seascape. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the New York seascape, but it's applicable to any seascape. November should be focusing on whales in the New York Harbor. January focusing on sharks. And in March, we'll be focusing on a really interesting species, the American eel. So last but not least, I'm going to provide you with one more link in the chat window. This is on the course site in Moodle that you do have access to, but just in case, I'll put it in the chat window. If you are interested in potentially doing the watershed model lesson with your students and thinking of ways to connect your students with Jason and urban ecology science, I just sent you a link to a Google Doc form just to express interest in whether or not you'd like to participate in a live webcast with Jason next month, which is scheduled for October 14th. I think that's it. Did anyone have any last questions before we say goodbye? All right, well, again, thank all of you so much for participating. We hope to see you in some of our future webinars, and I'll be in touch with you to send out reminders and thank yous and contact information by tomorrow. So have a great night, everyone.